a little bit. But since you brought it up, Nick, that's a great place to start. We're at crossover. Lawmakers get back to work on Wednesday. Kind of give us an overview of where we're at after the first half of the session.
Okay, so well, it's like, you know, halftime, and usually at crossover, the budget is not balanced. So, you know, obviously we've had two governors that have submitted budgets, you know, and they've had their own plan on how to balance a budget. But then when the legislature comes to town, they kind of sort of start over from scratch, and they don't plan on finishing it until the end of it. So right here at crossover, they're about half a billion dollars, you know, underwater. So they'll have to figure out what to do with either cut more expenditures, add more revenue, somehow to balance the budget.
Sure. And you said one thing, we had a conversation earlier, was that 2 years ago it was about $1 billion.
Absolutely.
Underwater at
2 years ago it was
time.
over $1 billion. And I think I can't ever remember a crossover where the budget has been balanced. So
No.
This is very typical.
Yeah,
Very typical place to be.
and we know that the legislature is looking for areas to cut, and I think that some of the requests that were coming in are probably less than what they would have been given, so that it's not surprising that we're $500 million under right now.
Correct.
And probably in pretty good shape.
March 9th, the revenue forecast is released. This is what everyone's been talking about for a good month or so now, and that's going to be really pivotal to the end of the session, decisions that are made, if more cuts will have to be made, if maybe there's some unexpected money someplace. Where are we at as far as that goes? I know you have a preliminary
Yep.
forecast, about a week in advance you get together, but give us an update there.
So right now we're working on that forecast. Moody's is working on it. We've given them the historical data. We've had a few conversations. We've gotten a little bit of information back and forth, so we're taking a look at that information. But one of the big drivers of this new forecast will be how well fourth quarter taxable sales and purchases does. And all indications are that fourth quarter taxable sales and purchases are again down from the fourth quarter 1 year ago. And that's very strong data that will go into the forecast. And also we've seen that in our sales tax collections. What we collected in January was about 40 million less just in sales tax than our previous forecast had shown. And those January collections represented the Christmas sales. So there was a lot riding on that, and that did not turn out well. I think there was a lot of weather-related issues in December. I will say that the month before that, the November sales that were collected in December, that was a good month. But December collected in January is very bad. So I think that no one should be looking to add revenue to the forecast. I just don't see how that can happen.
And to be clear, that 40 million for December collected or in January was for the 1 month, not for
that was
the fourth
for 1
quarter.
month, not for the whole fourth quarter. But when I say that the whole fourth quarter as a whole is down, it's those whole 3 months as a whole that are significantly less than they were a year ago.
Sure, and when you mentioned adding more monies to the revenue, is there any talk about doing anything with revenue enhancements, like asking our corporate friends to pay a little higher tax to help us through these rough times?
I've not heard any talk about that at all. There's been no talk of tax increases at all. The only talk that is going on is, how do we reduce the expenditures a little bit more?
Sure. Are you hearing back from individual agencies about the idea that we're maxed out? We are really cutting close to the bone or into the bone now. Is there anybody from any of the state agencies indicating that to you or your office?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're all complaining, but there's big concern out there. I mean, higher ed, obviously, they're down to, right now it's like 80% of where they were before. So that's a big cut, and they've been, they had through the allotments, they made some changes, and they've been continuing to make changes, but that's a big cut. And other agencies are about in that same boat. They're, everyone's well below, every agency is well below 90%, and I would say most of them are, probably right around 85%.
Sure.
So it's kind of, it's cutting into the bone.
Right.
So agencies are really going to have to do things differently.
Right.
You mentioned a couple of keys to balancing the budget in the end, and we know a lot of decisions will be made at the end, and this is when things get serious. But what are those two things that are going to be so pivotal to getting the budget balanced?
Well, I do think there's about two major things that are pivotal, and one of them is deciding how much of the oil revenues they're gonna let flow through to the general fund. Historically, there's been a $300 million cap, so we have this bucket list of how the revenues flow through. Only 300 million out of about 3 billion can go into the general fund. So if that cap were to be moved upward, which both governors proposed, and the legislature is talking about moving that upward too. That would allow more oil revenue to go into the general fund, and that would be ongoing revenue that could pay for the ongoing expenditures. So Governor Burgum has recommended that 900 million be allowed to flow into the general fund, and right now at crossover, the legislature, and this is on the House side, has recommended 400 million. So I would imagine it'll be between 400 million and 900 million. And again, that will depend on what the revenue forecast looks like.
Sure. So, and when that happens, if that were to come about, and it sounds like at least at some level that's going to happen, what does that mean then for those, typically that money would go into some savings, right?
It would go into some other
reserve
buckets.
accounts? Yeah.
So there's a tax relief fund, that's a bucket that it would flow into, but then the biggest bucket that's kind of at the bottom is the Strategic Investment and Improvement Fund. So the less money that goes to the general fund to pay for ongoing expenditures, the more money flows into the Strategic Investment and Improvement Fund, and that money can be used the following biennium for other projects.
I see.
And there was a second part to that too. The property tax relief is a significant
Right.
number as well.
It's such a big expenditure, and right now it's unknown which way it's going to be. What's going on right now is that there has been a 12% buy down, and the House appropriation seems to be favoring that approach. On the Senate side, there's a bill, it's 2206, and it has the state pay for the county's share of the social services. So it's, we call it the takeover bill. It'd be the state taking over the costs of the county delivering those social services. And so the Senate has passed that bill, so that's going to go to the House. And if that bill passes, that's going to be permanent property tax relief, and it will require ongoing funding for that. The buy down, they consider one time because it can be stopped any time. Right. And for the funding of that, they usually use the tax relief fund, which is one of the buckets from the oil money.
Sure. What, as you look forward, which of those two avenues would you think is more preferable or more advantageous to the state?
I don't know. I really couldn't tell you right now. I mean, if you want property tax permanent, then I think the social services is the way to go. If you think you want to stop it at some point or decrease it, then maybe the buy down is the way to go. But the risk with the just the 12% buy down, just the flat buy down, is that as property taxes increase and valuations increase, the state has to pay that 12%, and that 12% is going to get bigger.
Right.
Now, supposedly the rationale for the social services takeover is that because that will be not based on just increased valuations, but will be based on social services caseload, that will grow slower and won't grow as much.
Right. And we know the governor has stated that he wants the state to get out of the property tax buy-down business.
He does, yes,
So.
he has stated that.
And this has been an interesting session too, going all the way back to the beginning because of the number of budgets that lawmakers have been working with. That was interesting talking to you about that too. Have we made our way out of the woods from there?
Well, it's still confusing, but we went into this with Governor Dalrymple's budget bills, and then the legislature decided that they would have their own budget bills, so Legislative Council drafted their own budget bills that were based on a different base budget than the ones that Governor Dalrymple had submitted. So even before Governor Burgum, there are two sets of budgets. And then Governor Burgum comes in and he makes adjustments to the Dalrymple budget, so there's another set. So they've been working with the Dalrymple budget, the Bergen budget, their own baseline budget, and now they're, gonna craft, their own final version, which will be the fourth version.
And looking at, getting back to that $40 million number from January and how significant that is maybe playing into the revenue forecast release March 9th. It seems like a couple of weeks ago, in talking to some of the lawmakers, they had hoped maybe some of the heavy lifting work had been done in the first half. Has the tenor changed at the Capitol? Is there a little more uneasiness or nervousness now with the knowledge of the revenue we've collected from sales tax in December?
I think there's still an equal amount of uneasiness about everything. It really is an unknown factor, and a further concern is the fact that our budget stabilization fund will be empty by the end of this biennium. So we really no one wants to overspend the revenues because there's really no money left over. Which is another issue that the legislature, I assume, will deal with at some point, is how and if they're going to replenish the budget stabilization fund.
But if they're going to do that, that would likely have to come out of oil revenues.
Very likely.
Yeah.
Very likely would have to come, because the normal course and the formula for replenishing the budget stabilization fund is taking extra ending balance. And we're gonna have a zero ending balance this year.
Sure.
So there'll be no money.
So can you just switching gears just a little bit, can you talk to us about the importance of having passed Measure 2? What has that
can.
meant? I mean, our members were out in full support of it. As you know, North Dakota United spearheaded that. What does
We
that
did.
mean?
I'm very thankful that it passed. So first of all, it's about the Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund, and that is the fund that was able to hold K-12 harmless during the allotments. And now going forward, because it passed, the legislature is able to access that money for educational purposes.
K-12 educational purposes.
K-12
Yeah.
educational purposes, and that's what everyone wants, is K-12 purposes, yes. So in Governor Dalrymple's budget, he proposed that $140 million be used from the Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund to put into K-12, so they did not have to take a cut. Now Bergen has even upped that amount to $200 million.
Right.
And now at crossover, I believe the amount that came out of the House is that they would use $270 million of it. But the whole thing is that K-12 will not have to take a cut. Now that doesn't mean they'll get an increase. Right now it looks like they'll be even, which is not hold harmless as you go through 2 more years. It's hold even because other inflationary factors
Sure.
play into
And
that.
transportation.
Transportation, health insurance costs, just regular inflation. Costs a lot of money, so they wouldn't be getting that money. They would have to use their normal school funding for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, we were, frankly, that was a pretty big deal for us. We wanted to make sure that, because in our discussions with the legislature, they were pretty much saying that, K-12 is a big priority for us.
Mhm.
But if they were going to fund that fully, they would not have had the money to do other things. And so the cuts in public services would have been even greater.
Right.
And so we thought, because of the situation, nobody had ever expected there to be $600 million in the Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund, that we could tap into that somewhat to help alleviate and spread the hurt a little, if you will.
And I really believe, had that measure not passed, I really believe that K-12 would have had to take some cuts. That the per student payment would have had to have been cut, because it's just would have been too much money to put on all those other budgets. Because
Right.
it's difficult even with that money for K-12.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a big deal.
It is.
It's a
Measure
big
2
deal.
passed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I guess maybe just to summarize, what lenses are you looking through as we prepare for the second half?
Well.
We saw what happened in the Super Bowl.
Right. You bet it could be like that. Well, I'm not looking, I'm not anticipating that this revenue forecast is going to add any more dollars, so I don't think that's gonna be, everyone's gonna go, oh, phew, now we know what to do. I think they're gonna really have to make some difficult choices, and I think some of these cuts that everyone has been talking about are going to happen. I hope they don't have to go further. It's really important that we have a structurally balanced budget, because we don't want to put ourselves in a spot that makes it even worse 2 years down the road. So
Right.
it's important to keep all those in mind.
Can I ask you one other thing that I get asked frequently, and maybe you have too? But you mentioned Moody's before, and some people were asked me, well, what has happened that in the state? Is it that Moody's is having trouble predicting our economy or what our economic trends are? Are they getting good information or bad information? And in fact, somebody just asked me the other day that is Moody's the right people to go with if they, fail to predict our economic situation? Within reason.
Well, and that's a very, very good question, and Moody's and I have been struggling with how this works out, and so what you get out of the end is only as good as what goes in the beginning. And we start the process with making some assumptions on how many oil rigs are going to be there, how many wells are going to be drilled, and there's a relationship between the number of wells producing and the amount of sales,
Right.
of taxable sales and purchases. So what has happened over the years when our economy was just growing great guns and going like this, there was a relationship between wells producing and taxable sales and purchases. Now, when the price of oil just dropped drastically, what we found is the whole model changes and the relationship changes. And it's hard to get that relationship exact. Plus, it's hard to know when it's going great guns, how fast it's going to increase, but it's also hard to know how much it's going to decrease on the
Right.
downside. So I remember a little over a year ago when we did that first special revenue forecast to revise the budget, and at that time, the price of WTI was $26 a barrel or something, but we still had to make some assumptions about the rig count
Right.
and what it was going to be. Well, no one really knew what it was going to be, and it turns out those, the rig count assumptions were still too rosy. So then it went down even further than we thought it would, because when you're going on a downward trend, it's just different than when you're going on an upward
Right.
trend. So, and once again, we're finding that the relationship between the producing wells and taxable sales and purchases has changed again. And that could be, part of it could be because the rigs are just so much more efficient now. Maybe a lot of the money that they paid in taxes for those rigs has been spent and they don't have to keep paying it, and maybe that wasn't in the equation. But basically, it's the relationship between the two that is hard to get a handle on.
Yeah, and I've heard from some folks in the field that perhaps some of these oil companies and their suppliers for pipe or whatever other things they had, they pre-bought some of that stuff now because it's on discount because people wanted to move this. And so now even if the oil industry comes back and then you see the higher price per barrel, that might not result in the same level of tax
Exactly,
collection.
and we're hearing that too, and we think that's part of why the relationship has changed.
Sure.
There's a lot of factors in there, many of which we don't know at this point.
Right,
Complicated is a way to sum it up.
Yeah, it's
quickly.
complicated.
it is.
Wow.
So,
Well, yeah,
let me
go
just ask,
Yeah.
is there any bright spot in this economy? I mean, we are clearly a commodity
There
base.
is, because in western North Dakota, companies are hiring fracking crews, there's more
Yeah.
activity going on, so I think that is a bright spot. Our job numbers are good, our unemployment rate is good, so, and I think there are indications that maybe we're at the bottom. And you never know when you've come out of the bottom until afterwards,
Right.
but we're hoping that we're at the bottom of the trough.
Yeah.
Here's a hint, that's an optimistic note.
Way to end our Monday Facebook Live on a note of positivity.
There you go.
Nick, we appreciate it.
That's right.
Well, Pam, thanks so much for joining
You're
us
very
and taking
welcome.
some
Yeah, thank you for
time
being
to
here.
come in. I
Thank
know
you
a
for
lot of our
asking me.
members, or all of our members appreciate it as well. And we'll talk to you down the road. So
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your Monday, and the legislature reconvenes on Wednesday.
On
So
Wednesday.
we'll have many updates Friday in our legislative update. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Excellent.